The air in Redstone, Texas, held the last stubborn warmth of October, but it was a liar. Jesse Calhoun could feel the coming cold in the set of his shoulders, a familiar ache that heralded the first hard freeze. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue, and the dust of a long, dry summer still coated the clapboard fronts of the stores along the main street. He finished his business at the mercantile, the clerk tallying his winter supplies in a neat, spidery hand inside a heavy ledger. Flour, salt, coffee, beans, and enough tinned goods to see him through until the spring thaw made the pass from his High Valley ranch passable again. He carried the heavy sacks out to his wagon, the timbers of the boardwalk groaning under the weight of his boots. It was a solid wagon, built to last, just like the man who owned it. Jesse did not build things for show. He built them for purpose. His ranch, his fences, his life, they were all constructed with the same steady, deliberate hands. He loaded the sacks of flour and sugar, arranging them with the care of a man who understood the physics of a long, jostling ride. The last stop was the feed store for oats and a block of salt for the horses. The smell inside was one of his favorites, a dry, earthy scent of grain and hay and leather. He paid his bill, exchanged a few quiet words with the owner about the lack of rain, and then hauled the final sack of oats over his shoulder. Back at the wagon, he swung the sack up and over the side, intending to let it fall into the last open space. Instead of the expected solid thud, there was a soft gasp and a muffled thump. Jesse froze. He was a man who knew the sounds of his own world. He knew the sigh of wind through the pines that bordered his property, the low nicker of a horse wanting grain, the creak of old wood settling in the cold. This sound, this small human sound, did not belong. He moved slowly, not with alarm, but with a deep ingrained caution. He reached for the edge of the canvas tarp that covered the bed of his wagon. He lifted a corner. A pair of wide, terrified blue eyes stared back at him from the shadows. They belonged to a young woman, wedged between a sack of beans and the wooden wagon wall. She had a hand pressed to her mouth, and her dress, a fine blue wool that was hopelessly out of place amongst the dusty supplies, was rumpled and snagged. He said nothing. He simply held the canvas, his gaze steady, waiting. The silence stretched, broken only by the distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer and the low murmur of voices from the saloon down the street. Finally, she lowered her hand. Her voice was a bare whisper, rushed and desperate. "Please," she breathed. "Please, just pretend you don't see me. Just for a little while. Until you're out of town." Jesse let the canvas fall, dropping her back into darkness. He stood there for a long moment, his hand still resting on the rough material. He was not a man who invited trouble. His life was ordered, solitary, and predictable. A woman hiding in his wagon was none of those things. He could walk to the sheriff's office, report her, and be on his way home within the hour, his life undisturbed. It would be the sensible thing to do. He thought of the look in her eyes. It was not the look of a thief or a scoundrel. It was the look of a cornered animal, a desperate prayer in human form. His father had taught him many things, but the most important was that a man's character was measured by what he did when no one was watching, and by the trouble he was willing to take on for someone who could offer him nothing in return. He adjusted the sack of oats, settling it more carefully this time. He checked the ropes that secured the canvas, pulling them taut. He walked to the front of the wagon and took up the reins, his movements as unhurried as they had been all morning. He clicked his tongue, and the team of sturdy draft horses leaned into their harnesses. The wagon lurched forward, its wheels cutting through the thick dust of the street. They were nearing the edge of town, the last few houses giving way to open country, when he heard the riders. 3 of them, coming up fast from behind. Jesse kept his pace steady, his eyes forward. He did not need to look to know they were heading for him. Trouble had a sound all its own. They pulled alongside, 2 on his left and 1 on his right, effectively boxing him in. The man closest to him was thick-set, his face flushed and angry. "Calhoun," he grunted, his eyes scanning the canvas-covered wagon bed. "We're looking for someone. A woman. Name of Clara Voss. You seen her?" Jesse looked at the man, his expression unreadable. He let his gaze drift over the other two riders before returning to the first. "Can't say that I have," he said, his voice even and calm. "She was meant to be married this morning," the man spat. "To Mr. Hargrove. She ran. We have reason to believe she's trying to get out of Redstone." His eyes narrowed, fixing again on the canvas. "You wouldn't be giving a ride to anyone, would you? We know you're headed up to your valley. A good place to hide." From beneath the tarp, Jesse felt a tremor of movement, a small involuntary shudder of fear. He rested his hand on the brake lever, a casual gesture that nonetheless conveyed a sense of finality. He looked the man squarely in the eye. "The only woman I'm carrying today is my wife," he said. The lie came out smooth and solid, as if it were a rock he'd been carrying in his pocket for years. "And she's tired. It's a long ride home." The man's suspicion warred with Jesse's reputation. Jesse Calhoun was known throughout the county. He was quiet, kept to himself, and was as honest as the day was long. His word was his bond. If he said the woman in his wagon was his wife, then she was his wife. To call him a liar would be to invite a kind of trouble that these men, for all their bluster, were not prepared for. The rider held his gaze for another moment, then gave a curt, frustrated nod. "Our apologies, Mistress Calhoun," he called towards the canvas, his voice thick with sarcasm. He wheeled his horse around. "If you see a woman on the road, alone, you let us know." "I'll do that," Jesse said, his tone giving no indication that he would do anything of the sort. He watched them ride back towards town, their shoulders slumped in defeat. He waited until they were small figures in the distance before he clicked the reins again. The wagon rolled on. The silence from the back of the wagon was absolute. He drove for another hour, letting the familiar rhythm of the road and the steady pull of the horses calm the beat of his own heart. When he was sure they were clear, he pulled the wagon over in the shade of a small stand of cottonwoods that grew along a dry creek bed. He got down, his joints stiff, and walked to the back. He lifted the canvas. The woman, Clara, was sitting up now. Her face was pale, her blue eyes luminous in the dim light. "Thank you," she whispered. The words were small, but they carried the weight of a great debt. "They'll be watching the main road," Jesse said, his voice practical, ignoring her thanks. "They'll send riders up that way soon as they think on it." He looked west, towards the rugged, timbered hills that rose up to form the spine of the mountains. "There's another way. The old mountain road. It's longer, harder, but no one will look for us there." She nodded, her hands twisting in the fabric of her dress. "I have no right to ask you for anything else." "You're not asking," he said. "I'm telling you." He let the canvas fall and went to check the horses. He had taken on this trouble. Now he would see it through. The mountain road was little more than a pair of ruts carved into the earth, winding its way upward through dense stands of pine and juniper. The air grew thinner, cooler. Jesse guided the team with a steady hand, his focus entirely on the treacherous path ahead. Clara sat beside him now, the pretense of hiding no longer necessary. She was quiet, wrapped in a thick wool blanket he had given her from his bedroll. He learned her story in clipped, hesitant sentences as the wagon climbed. Her name was Clara Voss. Her mother had owned a dress shop in Redstone, a good one, but her mother had not been a good head for business. After she passed, the debts had fallen to Clara. Debts that had been quietly bought up by one man, Sterling Hargrove. He was a cattle baron, a man who owned half the county and had his eye on the other half. He had offered to forgive the debt in exchange for her hand in marriage. It was not her he wanted. It was a small parcel of land her grandfather had left her, a worthless-looking piece of rock and scrub, but it contained the headwaters of the creek that fed the entire valley. With that land, Hargrove would control the water. He would own them all. The wedding had been that morning. She had slipped out a back window while the guests were arriving. He engineered it all, she said, her voice low and bitter. The loans, the debt. He made it seem like he was helping. He's a patient man. He waited until I was trapped. Jesse listened, his jaw tight. He knew men like Hargrove, men who saw the world as a collection of things to be owned. As dusk began to settle, painting the undersides of the clouds in shades of bruised purple and rose, the first snowflakes began to fall. They were small and sparse at first, melting as they touched the ground. But as the light faded, they grew thicker, fatter, spinning in the cold air. "There's a line cabin not far from here," Jesse said, his voice tight with concern. "We need to get to it before this gets worse." The cabin was small, barely one room, with a stone fireplace and a single rough-hewn bunk built into the wall. It was dusty and smelled of cold ashes and mice, but it was shelter. Jesse had the horses unhitched and settled in the small lean-to, just as the snow began to fall in earnest, a thick, silent curtain that blotted out the world. Inside, he built a fire, his movements efficient and practiced. The flames caught, and a welcome warmth began to push back the chill. Clara stood by the single small window, watching the snow swirl and dance. The world they had left behind felt a lifetime away. They ate in silence, sharing the bread and cheese Jesse had in his saddlebags. The awkwardness between them was a palpable thing, a third presence in the small room. They were strangers, bound together by a desperate act and a lie. "You can take the bunk," he said when they were done. He spread his bedroll on the floor near the hearth. She looked at the narrow bunk, then at him. "That's not right. It's your cabin." "I'll be fine," he said, and the finality in his tone left no room for argument. He lay on the floor, listening to the crackle of the fire and the soft sound of her settling into the bunk. He stared into the flames, his thoughts churning. He had invited a storm into his quiet life. A woman with eyes the color of a mountain lake, and trouble that ran deeper than any canyon. He should have been regretting his decision, but as he drifted off to sleep, the only thing he felt was a strange, unsettling sense of rightness. He woke in the dead of night to a deeper cold. The fire had burned down to embers. He sat up, ready to add another log, and saw her. She was asleep in the bunk, but the blanket had slipped. In the faint glow of the embers, he saw that she had taken off her fine wool dress and was sleeping in her chemise. The dress was folded neatly over a stool by the fire. Laid across it was his own coat, a needle and thread moving through a tear in the sleeve he'd gotten from a snagged branch weeks ago. She had been mending his coat while he slept. He looked at the delicate, even stitches, a perfect, nearly invisible line of repair. It was a small thing, a quiet thing, an unspoken gesture of care that struck him more deeply than any words of thanks could have. He added a log to the fire, his movements slow and careful so as not to wake her. He watched the flames lick at the fresh wood, and for the first time, he felt the chill of his solitary life, not as peace, but as loneliness. The snow stopped by morning, leaving the world cloaked in a pristine, silent blanket of white. They made it to his ranch by late afternoon, the horses steaming and tired. The valley was even more beautiful under its mantle of snow, the pines heavy laden, the air sharp and clean. His ranch house was like him, solid, unadorned, and built to withstand the elements. Inside, a fire was laid in the hearth, ready to be lit. The furniture was simple, handmade. It was a man's house, clean and orderly, but lacking a certain warmth that had nothing to do with the temperature. For a week, an uneasy truce held. They moved around each other with a careful, polite distance. They spoke when necessary, about meals or the weather, but the silences were long and heavy. Then, the real storm hit. A blizzard swept down from the north, a howling fury of wind and snow that lasted for 3 days. When it was over, the pass was gone. buried under 10 feet of snow. They were trapped until spring. The realization settled over the house like the deep drifts outside. The polite distance was no longer sustainable. They were two people in a small house, with a long winter stretching before them. It started with a note. Clara was kneading bread at the big pine table in the kitchen one morning. She needed to ask him where the extra flour was stored, but he was on the far side of the room, cleaning a rifle, and the silence felt too large to break with such a mundane question. She tore a small piece from a brown paper sack, found a nub of charcoal, and wrote, "More flour?" She pushed it across the table. He looked at it, then at her. A flicker of something surprise, perhaps understanding, crossed his face. He took the charcoal and wrote on the other side, "Cellar, left wall." And so it began. The notes became their language. It was a way to speak without speaking, to bridge the silence without shattering it. The notes were practical at first. Need more wood for the stove. Mending your shirts. The basket is in the corner. The gray mare has a loose shoe. But as the weeks wore on, the notes began to change. They became observations. "Saw a red fox by the creek this morning," she wrote one day. He wrote back, "His den is under the big rock upstream. He's bold." Another time, he left a note by a cup of coffee he'd set on the table for her before he went out to the barn. "Snow is easing." She found it when she woke up, and the simple gesture warmed her more than the coffee. She replied on the same scrap of paper, leaving it for him to find at lunch. "The sun is trying to come out. It looks hopeful." They learned each other in fragments of charcoal on scraps of paper. He learned that she had a dry, understated wit. She learned that beneath his quiet exterior was a deep well of kindness. He would leave a wildflower he'd found in a sheltered spot by the woodpile for her. She would make sure his favorite stew was simmering on the stove when he came in from the cold. Jesse found himself watching her. The way she read by the firelight, her face serious and absorbed. The way she hummed softly to herself when she was baking. The way her presence had transformed his house. It was no longer just a shelter. It was a home. The silence that had once been a comfortable companion now felt empty when she was not in the room. He realized, with a jolt that was both terrifying and exhilarating, that he was memorizing her. The slope of her shoulders, the sound of her quiet breathing as she slept in the small room he had given her, the way she smiled when she saw one of his notes waiting for her. One evening in January, he came in from the barn, shaking the snow from his coat. The wind was howling, rattling the windows. She was sitting at the table, a book open before her, but she wasn't reading. She was just staring at the page. He saw the faint glint of a tear on her cheek. He hesitated, his hand on the door latch. The code of their silence felt inadequate for this. He walked to the table, took the charcoal, and wrote on a fresh scrap of paper, "Are you all right?" She looked at the note, and another tear fell. She picked up the charcoal. Her hand trembled slightly as she wrote, "I miss my mother. Today is her birthday." He sat down across from her. He didn't write anything else. He just sat there, a solid, silent presence in the warm kitchen as the storm raged outside. He sat with her until the tears stopped, and a quiet, settled peace returned to her face. It was the most intimate conversation they had ever had. February arrived with a false spring, a week of mild weather that melted the top layer of snow and turned the world to mud. The pass was still impassable, but the reprieve felt like a promise. The notes on the table became more about the future. "I wonder if the crocuses will bloom early this year," she wrote. He replied, "They always do, on the south-facing slope by the creek." He did not write what he was thinking, that he could not imagine this place without her in it to see them. The thought of her leaving when the pass opened was a constant dull ache in his chest. He would take her wherever she wanted to go, to another town, another state, somewhere Hargrove could never find her. He would do it because he was an honorable man, and he had given his unspoken word. But the thought of coming back to this valley, to this house, to the silence she had filled, was unbearable. The riders came on a Tuesday morning. The air was still and cold, the sky a hard, bright blue. Jesse was splitting wood when he heard them, the sound of shod hooves on the muddy road. He straightened up, the axe handle gripped tight in his hand. There were 7 of them, Hargrove at their head. Hargrove reined in his horse at the edge of the yard. He was a big man, dressed in an expensive coat, his face set in a mask of smug certainty. He had waited all winter. His patience had run out. "Calhoun," Hargrove called out, his voice carrying in the still air. "I've come for my property." Jesse did not move. He just stood there, the axe held loosely at his side. "You're on my land, Hargrove. You're not welcome here." The front door of the house opened. Clara stepped out onto the porch. She was not wearing a fine dress now, but a simple, practical one. She looked like she belonged there. There was no fear in her eyes, only a cold, hard resolve. "I am not your property, Mr. Hargrove," she said, her voice clear and strong. It was strange to hear her speak after so many months of written words. Her voice was as steady as his own. Hargrove laughed, a short, ugly sound. "A piece of paper says otherwise. A marriage license, signed and waiting, and a matter of some significant debt." He gestured to the men with him. "I'm not leaving without you." Clara took a step forward, to the edge of the porch. She reached into the bodice of her dress and pulled out a folded, worn piece of paper. It was creased and soft from being kept close to her skin for months. "I have a piece of paper, too," she said. "It's a letter from the banker in Redstone to his brother. In it, he details the instructions you gave him. How to structure my mother's loans so they would be impossible to repay. How to ensure the debt would fall to me. He wrote down every word you said. I believe the term for it is fraud." Hargrove's face went pale. He had underestimated her. He had seen a desperate girl, not a woman who would have the foresight to secure proof. "That's a lie," he blustered, but the conviction had gone from his voice. Jesse took a step forward, then another, until he was standing between Clara on the porch and Hargrove on his horse. He did not raise the axe. He simply stood there, a human wall. "She's on my land," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "That makes this my business. And I say her business with you is concluded. A standoff. 7 armed men against 1 with an axe." The odds were not in his favor. But as the silence stretched, a new sound emerged. The sound of more riders coming up the road from the valley. It was his neighbors. Miller from the South Ranch, Svensson from the East. Men he had known his whole life. They rode up and formed a silent line on the road, blocking Hargrove's retreat. They held no weapons, but their presence was more powerful than any gun. They were the valley, and the valley took care of its own. Hargrove looked at Jesse. He looked at Clara on the porch, holding the letter that could ruin him. He looked at the silent, watching men who had appeared on the road. He had been beaten, not by force, but by community, by courage, and by a truth written on a worn piece of paper. He spat on the ground, yanked his horse's head around, and rode away, his men trailing behind him like dogs. Jesse and Clara and the men of the valley watched them go. No one spoke until they were out of sight. Then Miller gave Jesse a short nod. "Calhoun," he said, a world of understanding in the single word. Then he and the others turned and rode back the way they had come. That evening, the silence in the house was different. It was not the comfortable silence of their notes, nor the awkward silence of their first days together. It was the heavy silence that follows a storm, when the world is washed clean and everything is changed. They sat by the fire, the box of paper scraps and charcoal nubs sitting untouched on the table. The need for them was gone. Jesse looked into the flames, searching for words he had never been good at finding. He had faced down 7 men without flinching, but this felt 100 times harder. "When the pass opens," he began, his voice rough, "I can take you anywhere you want to go. San Antonio, California, somewhere far away where you can start over. I've got money saved. It would be enough." Clara was watching him, her hands folded in her lap. She said nothing, just waited. He took a deep breath. "I'll take you," he said, finally looking at her. "I'll get you settled and safe. It's the right thing to do." He paused, and the truth of it, the heart of it, finally broke free. "I just don't know how I'd come back to this ranch if you weren't in it." The words hung in the air between them, simple and plain-spoken and more powerful than any poem. A slow smile spread across Clara's face, a smile of such profound relief and warmth that it seemed to light the entire room. "Jesse," she said, her voice soft, "I've been home since the first snow." They were married in the spring, in the small church in Redstone. The whole valley was there. The pass was open, and Clara was free to go anywhere in the world she chose. She chose the high valley, the solid house, and the quiet, steady man who had become her home. 5 years later, Jesse sat on the porch swing, his arm around his wife. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the valley that was now green with new life. A 4-year-old boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's blue eyes was chasing fireflies in the yard, his laughter echoing in the twilight. A baby girl slept soundly in a cradle just inside the open door. Clara leaned her head against his shoulder. On a small slate on the table beside them was a list for their next trip to town. Flour, sugar, coffee, new boots for Ben. He had written the first 3 items. She had added the last. They still spoke in notes sometimes, a quiet habit of the heart. He looked out at the land, his land, and at the family that now filled his house with noise and warmth, and a love so deep it felt as solid as the mountains themselves. He thought of that day in Redstone, of the desperate woman hiding in his wagon. He had thought he was taking on a world of trouble. He had been wrong. He had been taking on his whole world. He pulled her closer, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair. The silence between them was no longer an absence of words, but a language all its own.